Continue with here is taking a look at some of these cardiovascular adaptations in response to chronic training stress. We previously been talking about how the left ventricle, especially, gets larger in terms of diameter as well as more muscular, and we talked a lot about what this did for stroke volume. As we start looking at this a little bit more, it also is going to affect our heart rates at different workloads. So one of the things we see with the sustained training, and this is going to be more in that 6 to 8 weeks and a little bit longer than that, and not necessarily the super long-term training. But what we're going to see on this one is lower heart rates during submaximal workloads. Maximal workloads, we don't really see this difference, but that's mainly because a maximal workload is as hard as you can go, and you are still going to max out your heart rate at your maximum workload. That being said, your maximum workload now, might be higher than it was before, but it's, like I said, still your max workload. So compared to definitely untrained individuals, athletes are going to have lower heart rates, resting as well as submaximal workloads. Again, this has to do with the fact that the amount of work that the muscle is going to do is going to be pretty much related to oxygen delivery to that muscle. And if we have a larger stroke volume, we can still deliver the same amount of cardiac output to the muscles at a lower heart rate if the stroke volume goes up. So in reality, the heart is working more efficiently. What this means is, is if we can do that with a lower heart rate, if our heart rate stays close to the same maximum, it means we have a greater reserve to increase our output. So the fact that we're doing more with each beat means that we still have extra beats now when we get closer to those maximal levels. So that cardiac output will go up with those maximal levels. So heart rate, like I said, during exercise, submaximally, you're going to see a kind of a proportional decrease in that relative to the amount of training you're done. Again, depending on the level that you're working at, it might be quite a few beats lower after you've done about half a year of training on this. Maximal heart rate, like I said, tends to stay about the same or might drop just a little bit. But again, this doesn't mean that the heart is not being able to do as much. Cardiac output we'll see overall is up because those slight decreases in cardiac output do not cancel out the larger increases in stroke volume. And again, because it's a multiplication of those two things together, if we are increasing stroke volume, it means each beat is sending out more output. So we can do the same amount of output with a less number of beats. And you can kind of see this on this graph right here, looking at pre-training versus post-training. You can see at a particular speed on this one that, let's say 10 miles an hour, you can see post-training, you can do it at a lower heart rate than you can pre-training. And that's true kind of linearly throughout this, that post-training you're able to do the same level of intensity with less beats of the heart. And like I said, overall we see a slight decrease in that heart rate, but again, that amount of stroke volume, if we're looking at cardiac output, we'll see probably on these ones right here that there is actually a greater cardiac output at that level than would be at these ones at a higher heart rate. The other thing we see on this one is because we're doing more with each beat, we tend to get back to a resting state a little bit quicker after someone has been trained. So this is what we refer to as heart rate recovery. It's the amount of time before an athlete can get back to their resting state. Generally, as you train more and more, your heart rate recovery is going to be faster, so you're going to get back to that resting state quicker. Again, partly because you're pumping more out with each beat, so you're able to put a lot of those things, a lot of that oxygen debt and other things like that we talked about, you're able to put that back to normal a little bit sooner, so that heart rate can decrease sooner because you're, again, doing more with each beat. And this, again, just kind of shows it here, pre-training and post-training. You can see the particular exercise, again, lower heart rates to do the same amount of exercise. But then you can see here, though, after training, the heart rate is lower right away, and it gets back to that resting state quicker than we see with this. And again, it's a way to look at cardiorespiratory fitness. If your heart rate recovery is good, it probably means that you're not overtraining, that you're in good shape. Again, other things will influence this, and we'll talk about some of those factors like altitude and heat and how they could mess with this later on. Definitely going to not let that recovery be quite as quick. Again, not a way we can compare one athlete to another on this one though. It's pretty specific to that person. So 25 beats of recovery for one person might mean it was a big change versus before where somebody else it might not. So it's not like you can compare this person to this person over here and their heart rate recovery was more beats. They're definitely in better shape. That's not what we can do with this number. So again, that cardiac output, because we are doing increases in stroke volume, were quite large with training over this period of time. We can see at maximal workloads, we're capable of doing a higher cardiac output. So again, that cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart in a minute. Again, cardiac output at those submaximal levels, it doesn't really change much. The main reason for that is again, remember, steady state is meaning you're working at a certain level. A certain amount of cardiac output is required to do a steady state type of activity. That doesn't change much. But what can change is your max. You are able to put out a lot more at your max because at all the submaximal levels, you're doing it with less heartbeats. So this means that cardiac output at those maximal levels, we'll see, can get quite a bit higher with training. And again, you can see it right here. Post-training, you can see the number, we've almost increased it like 8 to 10 liters per minute with training at maximal. Again, at these submaximal speeds, it takes a certain amount of output to run on a treadmill at 10. It's not going to be much different pre-training and post-training, the amount of output it takes. Again, you're doing this with less beats and post-training, but again, that gives you that reserve up here. And again, it's because these are that multiplication. If we're doing more with the stroke volume, it takes less heartbeats, which means overall, when we actually get up to that max heart rate, even if it's 1 to 2, 3 beats slower, those increases in stroke volume mean we are putting out a greater output. So with training, we might be able to have the heart outputting 6, 7, 8 liters more per minute after you've trained at maximum. The other thing we see a lot with this is over time with training, it tends to lower blood pressure. Both systolic and diastolic at particular levels of exercise are going to be lower, as well as at rest. This makes it easier to push that blood to there and does not make the heart work as hard to push the blood through these blood vessels. And again, it has the greatest effect on people with high blood pressure. Again, lower resting and submaximal ones, generally with training over a period of time, you can see about a 10 millimeter of mercury decrease. So if you're 130 over, let's say 90, you might be 120 over 90 or 120 over 85 after going through this. The other thing is that maximum number on the diastolic tends to drop, and part of this is we get much better at having sympathetic stimulation at rest. We have less of it, so we have less weight generally with endurance exercise. And again, because you're training your body to be active, it tends to not have as much sympathetic stimulation when it is not being active. So these things help to dilate those blood vessels out a little bit more and make that resting blood pressure a bit lower. So again, blood pressure and training, definitely not a lot on these ones, but you're going to see a little bit lower levels at submaximal levels. Resting blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic, should drop. Weightlifting, like I said, can change the stuff here, but it doesn't tend to have a long-term effect on resting blood pressure. Another thing that we see with the cardiovascular system is we are generally going to see in areas that are working hard during these particular endurance exercises, we are going to see increases in capillaries in these areas. So increased capillarization of the heart because it is being worked a little bit more with these demands. We'll also see changes in capillarization in the skeletal muscle. So again, the heart, because we're working hard and keeping these beats up during this particular period of activity that we're doing with training, This is going to increase the capillary amounts and density in the heart. This means more delivery to the heart, because I'll be able to keep those energy demands of the heart being met. The other thing we see this is in those muscles that we're working, we're going to tend to see increased capillarization of the skeletal muscle. Most evident in slow twitch muscles. We'll talk about fast twitch and slow twitch a little bit more when we start talking about muscular changes. But the main thing is the muscles, we're going to see a greater density of capillaries per kind of cross-sectional area of muscles. What, again, this means is we are delivering more blood to those muscles because we have a better delivery system at this point. So that capillarization, higher capillary to fiber ratio, we can open these up a lot better. And again, because we know we are having changes in blood distribution with activity, we are going to get more blood going to these active muscles and are delivering it more efficiently. And this kind of shows the idea right here. Here is untrained muscle. You can see some of these little capillaries in the spaces here. Now we can see this zoomed in a little bit more capillaries surrounding each of these fibers. Again, going to more efficiently deliver oxygen, which means at higher levels of intensity, we are still getting good oxygen delivery to this muscle. So 10 to 15% changes or increases in capillary development in these muscles. We also are going to see some changes in red blood cell volumes and plasma volume. So overall, blood volume tends to go up. It actually goes up enough that there's a slight dilution of your blood vessels, of your red count. So your hematocrit tends to drop just a little bit. That doesn't mean your oxygen carrying capacities drop, though. What we're seeing is about a little less than a liter, about 3/4 of a liter increases in plasma volume. We are also seeing an increase in red blood cell volume overall. So we're getting a higher amount of red blood cells. It's went up, but the plasma volumes went up a little bit more. So your hematocrit actually drops a little bit. But again, what this means is when you start exercising, you have a greater, one of the things we talked about recently was that plasma volume is going to drop when you start an exercise, and if it drops too much, that can inhibit performance. If we have more plasma volume, it means we have more to lose before performance is going to be inhibited. And it also means we are carrying more oxygen overall in the blood, not as much per volume of blood, but overall there's a greater carrying capacity of oxygen in the blood. So again, endurance training does increase blood volume. It increases more so the plasma volume due to a few other things being retained in the blood. Again, red blood volume, cell volume also increases, but because the plasma volume increases are greater, we actually see an overall decrease in that hematocrit or that red blood cell concentration. But this makes it so the blood is actually a little bit thinner. It can travel through the blood vessels a little bit easier with less peripheral resistance. And again, also means those changes in plasma volume, we're able to not have as great a loss of plasma volume. As we start doing that activity, we have more plasma volume in reserve. It also is going to help the increased plasma volume with venous return to the heart, which can again assist with that stroke volume and that cardiac output. Another thing we're going to see is with work here, and this kind of again goes to some of the stuff we talked about back in AMP2. You get an increased blood volume, you are going to get increased levels of red blood cells and hemoglobin. This is in part because that aerobic training is going to lead to you releasing your erythropoietin and increase our red blood cell numbers. Again, like it says there, total blood volume goes up about 25%. Red blood cell volumes also an increase, and hemoglobin content within those is going to increase. So even though we have a slightly more dilute and thinner blood, its oxygen carrying capacity has also increased, and the fact that we can carry more and we also have a better delivery due to that increased capillarization in the muscles means we can carry more O2 and deliver it to these working muscles. Again, more efficient. So this kind of talks a lot about all the different things we talked about here so far. So heart rate, Overall, with training, we're going to see it tends to drop at each of these levels quite a bit at rest and at submaximal levels. A little bit of a decrease at maximal here. Overall, after endurance training, we are going to see increases in stroke volume. Again, because it is some particular level of output necessary to be at rest or necessary to do some type of submaximal, like 50% of VO2 max, it's going to take a certain amount of cardiac output to do that. So we don't really see changes in cardiac output at rest or at submaximal levels. But because we're doing, again, more with each beat, when we get to those max beats of the heart, due to the way cardiac output is calculated, it means that we definitely have the ability to increase our cardiac output at maximal effort. The heart has become bigger, mainly the left ventricle diameter and wall. We have increases in blood volume, increases in hemoglobin levels, increases in capillary density across the board on this. And this is just a nice little thing that kind of ties this together. Again, we know cardiac output and arteriovenous difference of oxygen are the two things that go into VO2 max. What we've spent most of our time today talking about was things over here. So a lot of what we talked about here, that left ventricle hypertrophy increases contractility, the thickness of the wall, as well as the volume, increases the amount of preload we can get. We get increases in stroke volume, which even if this doesn't change, we are going to see increases in VO2 max. So we spent a lot of time on the left side of this one today. We did talk a little bit about increased blood flow to the muscles, better density, but some of what we'll talk about a little bit later on in the second half of this here is we're going to talk a little bit about changes in the muscle and changes in the cell, within the cells of the muscle. So as we get into this a little bit more metabolically, we are going to see changes in oxidative enzymes, changes in the number and size of mitochondria. These are going to be things that can also increase this, along with the increased blood flow and the capillary numbers, which we know are going to deliver better and at least lead to increases in this. So the second set of these talks here, talking about these adaptations, again, are going to focus a little bit more on the metabolic changes here in the muscle cells, as well as some of those some of the respiratory changes that are going to be happening. So I will talk to you next time.